He stood a long moment in silence, posed like a bronze statue on the rock. "It's a walled city, right enough," he muttered presently. "Was that where you were going, when you tried to send me off alone to the coast?" "I saw it before you came. I knew nothing of it when I left Sukhmet." "Who'd have thought to find a city here? I don't believe the Stygians ever penetrated this far. Could black people build a city like that? I see no herds on the plain, no signs of cultivation, or people moving about." "How could you hope to see all that, at this distance?" she demanded. He shrugged his shoulders and dropped down on the shelf. "Well, the folk of the city can't help us just now, and they might not if they could. The people of the Black Countries are generally hostile to strangers. Probably stick us full of spears." He stopped short and stood silent, as if he had forgotten what he was saying, frowning down at the crimson spheres gleaming among the leaves. "Spears," he muttered. "What a blasted fool I am not to have thought of that before. That shows what a pretty woman does to a man's mind." "What are you talking about?" she inquired. Without answering her question, he descended to the belt of leaves and looked down through them. The great brute squatted below, watching the crag with the frightful patience of the reptile folk. So might one of his breed have glared up at their troglodyte ancestors, treed on a high-flung rock in the dim dawn ages. Conan cursed him without heat and began cutting branches, reaching out and severing them as far from the end as he could reach. The agitation of the leaves made the monster restless. He rose from his haunches and lashed his hideous tail, snapping off saplings as if they had been toothpicks. Conan watched him warily from the corner of his eye, and just as Valeria believed the dragon was about to hurl himself up the crag again, the Cimmerian drew back and climbed up to the ledge with the branches he had cut. There were 3 of these, slender shafts about 7 feet long, but not larger than his thumb. He had also cut several strands of tough, thin vine. "Branches too light for spear hafts, and creepers no thicker than cords," he remarked, indicating the foliage about the crag. "It won't hold our weight, but there's strength in union. That's what the Aquilonian renegades used to tell us Cimmerians when they came into the hills to raise an army to invade their own country. But we always fight by clans and tribes." "What the devil has that got to do with those sticks?" she demanded. "You wait and see." Gathering the sticks in a compact bundle, he wedged his poniard hilt between them at one end. Then with the vines he bound them together, and when he had completed his task, he had a spear of no small strength, with a sturdy shaft 7 feet in length. "What good will that do?" she demanded. "You told me that a blade couldn't pierce his scales." "He hasn't got scales all over him," answered Conan. "There's more than one way of skinning a panther." Moving down to the edge of the leaves, he reached the spear up, and carefully thrust the blade through one of the apples of Derketa, drawing aside to avoid the darkly purple drops that dripped from the pierced fruit. Presently he withdrew the blade, and showed her the blue steel stained a dull purplish crimson. "I don't know whether it will do the job or not," quoth he. "There's enough poison there to kill an elephant, but, well, we'll see." Valeria was close behind him as he let himself down among the leaves. Cautiously holding the poisoned pike away from him, he thrust his head through the branches and addressed the monster. "What are you waiting down there for, you misbegotten offspring of questionable parents?" was one of his more printable queries. "Stick your ugly head up here again, you long-necked brute, or do you want me to come down there and kick you loose from your illegitimate spine?" There was more of it, some of it couched in eloquence that made Valeria stare, in spite of her profane education among the seafarers. And it had its effect on the monster. Just as the incessant yapping of a dog worries and enrages more constitutionally silent animals, so the clamorous voice of a man rouses fear in some bestial bosoms and insane rage in others. Suddenly, and with appalling quickness, the mastodonic brute reared up on its mighty hind legs and elongated its neck and body in a furious effort to reach this vociferous pygmy, whose clamor was disturbing the primeval silence of its ancient realm. But Conan had judged his distance with precision. Some 5 feet below him the mighty head crashed terribly but futilely through the leaves, and as the monstrous mouth gaped like that of a great snake, Conan drove his spear into the red angle of the jawbone hinge. He struck downward with all the strength of both arms, driving the long poniard blade to the hilt in flesh, sinew, and bone. Instantly the jaws clashed convulsively together, severing the triple-pieced shaft and almost precipitating Conan from his perch. He would have fallen but for the girl behind him, who caught his sword belt in a desperate grasp. He clutched at a rocky projection and grinned his thanks back at her. Down on the ground the monster was wallowing like a dog with pepper in its eyes. He shook his head from side to side, pawed at it, and opened his mouth repeatedly to its widest extent. Presently he got a huge front foot on the stump of the shaft and managed to tear the blade out. Then he threw up his head, jaws wide and spouting blood, and glared up at the crag with such concentrated and intelligent fury that Valeria trembled and drew her sword. The scales along his back and flanks turned from rusty brown to a dull, lurid red. Most horribly, the monster's silence was broken. The sounds that issued from his blood-streaming jaws did not sound like anything that could have been produced by an earthly creation. With harsh, grating roars, the dragon hurled himself at the crag that was the citadel of his enemies. Again and again his mighty head crashed upward through the branches, snapping vainly on empty air. He hurled his full ponderous weight against the rock until it vibrated from base to crest, and rearing upright he gripped it with his front legs like a man and tried to tear it up by the roots, as if it had been a tree. This exhibition of primordial fury chilled the blood in Valeria's veins, but Conan was too close to the primitive himself to feel anything but a comprehending interest. To the barbarian, no such gulf existed between himself and other men, and the animals, as existed in the conception of Valeria. The monster below them, to Conan, was merely a form of life differing from himself, mainly in physical shape. He attributed to it characteristics similar to his own, and saw in its wrath a counterpart of his rages, in its roars and bellowings merely reptilian equivalents to the curses he had bestowed upon it. Feeling a kinship with all wild things, even dragons, it was impossible for him to experience the sick horror which assailed Valeria at the sight of the brute's ferocity. He sat watching it tranquilly, and pointed out the various changes that were taking place in its voice and actions. "The poison's taking hold," he said with conviction. "I don't believe it." To Valeria it seemed preposterous to suppose that anything, however lethal, could have any effect on that mountain of muscle and fury. "There's pain in his voice," declared Conan. "First he was merely angry because of the stinging in his jaw. Now he feels the bite of the poison. Look, he's staggering. He'll be blind in a few more minutes. What did I tell you?" For suddenly the dragon had lurched about and went crashing off through the bushes. "Is he running away?" inquired Valeria uneasily. "He's making for the pool." Conan sprang up, galvanized into swift activity. "The poison makes him thirsty. Come on. He'll be blind in a few moments, but he can smell his way back to the foot of the crag. And if our scent's here still, he'll sit there until he dies. And others of his kind may come at his cries. Let's go." "Down there?" Valeria was aghast. "Sure, we'll make for the city. They may cut our heads off there, but it's our only chance. We may run into 1,000 more dragons on the way, but it's sure death to stay here. If we wait until he dies, we may have 12 more to deal with. After me, in a hurry." He went down the ramp as swiftly as an ape, pausing only to aid his less agile companion, who, until she saw the Cimmerian climb, had fancied herself the equal of any man in the rigging of a ship or on the sheer face of a cliff. They descended into the gloom below the branches and slid to the ground silently, though Valeria felt as if the pounding of her heart must surely be heard from far away. A noisy gurgling and lapping beyond the dense thicket indicated that the dragon was drinking at the pool. "As soon as his belly is full, he'll be back," muttered Conan. "It may take hours for the poison to kill him, if it does at all." Somewhere beyond the forest, the sun was sinking to the horizon. The forest was a misty twilight place of black shadows and dim vistas. Conan gripped Valeria's wrist and glided away from the foot of the crag. He made less noise than a breeze blowing among the tree trunks, but Valeria felt as if her soft boots were betraying their flight to all the forest. I don't think he can follow a trail, muttered Conan. But if a wind blew our body scent to him, he could smell us out. Mitra grant that the wind blow not, Valeria breathed. Her face was a pallid oval in the gloom. She gripped her sword in her free hand, but the feel of the chagrin-bound hilt inspired only a feeling of helplessness in her. They were still some distance from the edge of the forest when they heard a snapping and crashing behind them. Valeria bit her lip to check a cry. "He's on our trail," she whispered fiercely. Conan shook his head. "He didn't smell us at the rock, and he's blundering about through the forest trying to pick up our scent. Come on, it's the city or nothing now. He could tear down any tree we'd climb, if only the wind stays down." They stole on until the trees began to thin out ahead of them. Behind them, the forest was a black, impenetrable ocean of shadows. The ominous crackling still sounded behind them as the dragon blundered in his erratic course. "There's the plain ahead," breathed Valeria. "A little more and we'll—" "Crom!" swore Conan. "Mitra!" whispered Valeria. Out of the south a wind had sprung up. It blew over them directly into the black forest behind them. Instantly a horrible roar shook the woods. The aimless snapping and crackling of the bushes changed to a sustained crashing as the dragon came like a hurricane straight toward the spot from which the scent of his enemies was wafted. "Run!" snarled Conan, his eyes blazing like those of a trapped wolf. "It's all we can do." Sailors' boots are not made for sprinting, and the life of a pirate does not train one for a runner. Within 100 yards, Valeria was panting and reeling in her gait, and behind them the crashing gave way to a rolling thunder as the monster broke out of the thickets and into the more open ground. Conan's iron arm about the woman's waist half lifted her. Her feet scarcely touched the earth, as she was borne along at a speed she could never have attained herself. If he could keep out of the beast's way for a bit, perhaps that betraying wind would shift. But the wind held, and a quick glance over his shoulder showed Conan that the monster was almost upon them, coming like a war galley in front of a hurricane. He thrust Valeria from him with a force that sent her reeling a dozen feet to fall in a crumpled heap at the foot of the nearest tree, and the Cimmerian wheeled in the path of the thundering Titan. Convinced that his death was upon him, the Cimmerian acted according to his instinct, and hurled himself full at the awful face that was bearing down on him. He leaped, slashing like a wildcat, felt his sword cut deep into the scales that sheathed the mighty snout, and then a terrific impact knocked him rolling and tumbling for 50 feet, with all the wind and half the life battered out of him. How the stunned Cimmerian regained his feet, not even he could have ever told. But the only thought that filled his brain was of the woman lying dazed and helpless, almost in the path of the hurtling fiend. And before the breath came whistling back into his gullet, he was standing over her with his sword in his hand. She lay where he had thrown her, but she was struggling to a sitting posture. Neither tearing tusks nor trampling feet had touched her. It had been a shoulder or front leg that struck Conan, and the blind monster rushed on, forgetting the victims whose scent it had been following, in the sudden agony of its death throes. Headlong on its course it thundered until its low-hung head crashed into a gigantic tree in its path. The impact tore the tree up by the roots, and must have dashed the brains from the misshapen skull. Tree and monster fell together, and the dazed humans saw the branches and leaves shaken by the convulsions of the creature they covered, and then grow quiet. Conan lifted Valeria to her feet, and together they started away at a reeling run. A few moments later they emerged into the still twilight of the treeless plain. Conan paused an instant, and glanced back at the ebon fastness behind them. Not a leaf stirred, nor a bird chirped. It stood as silent as it must have stood before man was created. "Come on," muttered Conan, taking his companion's hand. "It's touch and go now, if more dragons come out of the woods after us." He did not have to finish the sentence. The city looked very far away across the plain, farther than it had looked from the crag. Valeria's heart hammered until she felt as if it would strangle her. At every step she expected to hear the crashing of the bushes, and see another colossal nightmare bearing down upon them. But nothing disturbed the silence of the thickets. With the first mile between them and the woods, Valeria breathed more easily. Her buoyant self-confidence began to thaw out again. The sun had set, and darkness was gathering over the plain, lightened a little by the stars that made stunted ghosts out of the cactus growths. "No cattle, no plowed fields," muttered Conan. "How do these people live?" "Perhaps the cattle are in pens for the night," suggested Valeria, "and the fields and grazing pastures are on the other side of the city." "Maybe," he grunted. "I didn't see any from the crag, though." The moon came up behind the city, etching walls and towers blackly in the yellow glow. Valeria shivered. Black against the moon, the strange city had a somber, sinister look. Perhaps something of the same feeling occurred to Conan, for he stopped, glanced about him, and grunted. "We stop here. No use coming to their gates in the night. They probably wouldn't let us in. Besides, we need rest, and we don't know how they'll receive us. A few hours' sleep will put us in better shape to fight or run." He led the way to a bed of cactus which grew in a circle, a phenomenon common to the southern desert. With his sword he chopped an opening and motioned Valeria to enter. "We'll be safe from snakes here anyhow." She glanced fearfully back toward the black line that indicated the forest some 6 miles away. "Suppose a dragon comes out of the woods?" "We'll keep watch," he answered, though he made no suggestion as to what they would do in such an event. He was staring at the city, a few miles away. Not a light shone from spire or tower. A great black mass of mystery, it reared cryptically against the moonlit sky. "Lie down and sleep. I'll keep the first watch." She hesitated, glancing at him uncertainly, but he sat down cross-legged in the opening, facing toward the plain, his sword across his knees, his back to her. Without further comment, she lay down on the sand inside the spiky circle. "Wake me when the moon is at its zenith," she directed. He did not reply, nor look toward her. Her last impression, as she sank into slumber, was of his muscular figure, immobile as a statue hewn out of bronze, outlined against the low-hanging stars.